Welcome to Bodcast, the Business of Dentistry podcast, brought to you by Practice Plan. Bodcast delivers the best business advice, real-life stories, and practical hints and tips to make your practice a more profitable and sustainable business. And now, here's your host.
Hi, I'm Michelle Hardy. I'm the Sales Support Manager for Practice Plan. And I'm delighted today to be joined by one of our good friends, Barry Oulton.
Thank you very much.
Barry ran a series of workshops for us earlier in the year. Great success. Our practices loved it. So we didn't want to miss this opportunity to invite Barry back to come along and share some of his little pearls of wisdom with us today. So, Barry, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me back. I've missed you.
We've missed you too, my lovely. So, Barry, today we just want to focus on patient journey, which is a subject I know that you're absolutely passionate about, to give some little pearls of your wisdom to our practices. So I guess to start with, what would you define as the perfect patient experience in a dental practice?
Perfect patient experience in the dental practice or connected to the dental practice, because for me, I think it starts before they even come inside the practice.
I would agree, yes.
I think for those that attended the best tour ever, we looked at the patient journey and broke it into like 15 touch points. So a touch point is any moment that an organization can interact with a customer or potential customer. And so what we did at our practice is to, rather than thinking that this journey was just one thing, was to look at each of the steps within the journey and then to think, how could we make each of those touch points the best version of themselves? So for us, the first touch point is, how are we attracting the patient to the practice? And the last touch point is, how do we then ask our happy patients to recommend their friends, family, colleagues, neighbours? And so for me, the last one and the first one loop back to each other, because the way that we attracted our patients were to knock the socks off our existing patients and then ask them to send their family and friends. But I guess the first one also includes marketing, your website, everything that is out there, your branding, all of that. In terms of the experience in the practice, I think it's encouraging an atmosphere and an environment and behaviours that make the patient feel as comfortable as humanly possible, given that they're in a dental practice, making your dentistry as comfortable as possible, so having really great technique, and then being aware of how best to communicate to each individual patient based on how they like to be communicated with.
Yes, you touched on the comfort element there, and sort of how do you can you just give us a few extra little tips on how do you go about making your patients feel that it's a comfortable experience for them from the moment they walk through those doors?
Right.
Likewise, I agree with you. You said this starts well before they get through the door, but is there any little extra touches that you can sort of share with us that you do to make it, a memorable experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So language that we use in our heads weaves magic, right? So if I said to you, and you can't process a negative. So if I said to you, what we do in this practice, there won't be any pain. You have to formulate a picture in your head of what pain is in order to then think what pain isn't. So I've generated a negative image. I've connected it to pain. We've linked that to dentistry, even though my intention is to assure you and reassure you that we're going to be comfortable. So first and foremost is language. So the language that we use on our marketing, but also as soon as people are in the building, is we'll use positive, affirmative language of what it is that we will be doing, not what we will be avoiding. So rather than saying there won't be any pain, we say everything we're going to do is completely comfortable. Then we have really small little nuanced things that we do that increase the likelihood of it being comfortable. So for example, I developed an injection technique, the comfortable dental injection technique, where my patients do not have a clue that they've had the injection. So we use topical anesthetic, we'll invoke the gate theory, we'll do things that is a little bit kind of smoke and mirrors, and then say, how was your injection? The patient goes, what injection?
Yeah.
And he goes, see, I'm really
Fabulous
good.
Feeling for the patient.
And so we're building on that. And there's this thing that I learned when I did my training in NLP called anchoring. So let me give you an example of that. Have you ever been driving your car and a song comes on and you go, oh, I love this song. This reminds me of, and it reminds you, takes you back in time to a memory. Well, that's called an anchor, and we can anchor, it anchors a state, a feeling. So you hear this song and you're like, oh, I remember this, that's our first date, or whatever. And so we can do that with our patients. I want to anchor them to me being comfortable, everything being carefully looked after, and them have this feeling of comfort when they see me. And I think, in hindsight, that really truly worked, because the reason I said it right at the beginning, there is obviously some marketing. We didn't market for 18 years. It was all by word of mouth. And so you get known as being that comfortable dentist. So it's little tiny things that actually make a big difference.
Yes. So, just building on that a little bit, how important do you feel is effective communication within the team and part of this journey? And how can we help dental teams improve on that?
So how important is it? I think it is, ultimately is the most important thing. I think problems only occur in the absence of a conversation. I think arguments and disagreements happen when there's miscommunication, and we miscommunicate all of the time, and that's okay if we're consciously aware of it and then we do something to correct it. I think communication within the team and the culture of the team is imperative, because if you have an aligned value that the aim of the game is to knock the patient's socks off, and it's a very supportive and nurturing environment for the team, then if somebody does miscommunicate, it doesn't get blown out of proportion, because it's not about them. It's about, okay, what do we do that's best for the patient and us and everything else? So without good communication, I think it can become toxic. And I've been in places that are really toxic because the communication is so poor and they haven't resolved issues, and there's been miscommunication. We've all been there, right? Somebody says something to you and you go, yeah, whatever. And they go, no, I didn't mean that. And so communication is key. Training in communication, I think, is the most important thing. I would say that because that's what I do. But I think we all think that we can communicate because when we came out the womb, we just kind of learned what we learned, but we weren't formally taught. And I think, unfortunately, one of the biggest things the world over is we don't know what we don't know. And so when I share these little nuggets, people are like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. So getting some training in communication is really powerful, really useful, because everybody's doing their best. And yet we can learn things that will enable us to do better.
Absolutely. And you're right, it starts right from the team having that before you can then pass that on to the patient. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it shines out of teams, doesn't it, when they get it right? So
it does shine out of teams. You've just touched on. So when you communicate, right, it's what we say, how we say it, so the tone of how we say it, and our body that goes with it. Most of us think that the words that we say are the most important, but it's not. It's how you say it and your body that goes with it. So if I say to you, nice dress, the words that I used were nice dress, but you're thinking, you cheeky monkey.
Get you.
Yeah, because my tone was wrong. So filtering back to team, if there's discourse in the team, even if the words that they use in front of a patient are positive, how they use the words, how they, you leak out how you're feeling in how you say it and how your body reacts. People pick up on that. Right, when you walk in, I used to do this when I'd walk home, ex-wife, right? I'd walk through the door and I'd go, hi, and I'd see it and go, okay, not now. Because you can just see that people are in a weird frame, even if they use the word, and sense it.
Yes.
So it has to be led by the team, because otherwise patients know. Patients pick up on it. We call it the sixth sense, but it's really not. It's part and parcel of what we do.
Of course it is. Barry, I know that you've worked with lots of practices in your time, but can you just give us an example of one that you really think is stand out in terms of the way they deliver their patient care and this experience for the patients, and what actually is it that it sets them apart from the rest?
I'm really lucky to have a few of those right now that I work with. And I would say, so what really stands them apart in terms of the experience is what they do for their patients. And it's not the dentistry. On the tour, I didn't want to upset people, and I said, I don't want to upset you. But here it is, and that is nobody cares about your dentistry so long as it's good enough. So if your dentistry is good enough, 7 out of 10, no one cares about the dentistry being 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10, other than us. We do. What patients care about is how they're looked after, is how they have the dentistry delivered to them. It's how they're cared for. It's how they're cared for before, during, and after. It's how they're looked after if there's a problem, if there's a cancellation or something happens. It's the whole experience that really matters. And so the practices that stand out, I think first and foremost, are the ones that understand that. I think the practices that truly stand out for me are the ones that take the patient journey, the patient experience and the patient care at the absolute epicenter of everything that they do. They just happen to be doing dentistry.
Yeah.
And so when they really focus on knocking the patient's socks off and making sure the patient has the best experience, funnily enough, they end up being able to do more dentistry, because happy patients want to do more dentistry and then start to do the wants-based dentistry. So they're more inclined to do cosmetic stuff and so on and so forth. So the practices that I think that are really nailing it are the ones that are consistently looking at improving it and putting it at the forefront of what they do.
And we know, don't we, Barry, that in practices, all patients have got different styles, the way they like to be treated.
Yeah.
You know, you can't have one rule that, well, this is how we look after all of our patients. So getting down to the nitty gritty, how can they tailor that experience to individual patient needs, you know, making sure they get it right for all sort of personality types and,
Yeah.
you know, those that are scared, those that are, I just want to get in, get out and get done. You know, it's having that consistency in terms of good service. But, you know, how do they sort of start to tailor make that to individual patients?
That's a really good question. And so I'm probably going to give you this on 2 levels, right? Because I could go into all of the nuances of how we as individuals process information, whether we're visual, auditory, kinesthetic, or auditory digital. And that is, when you start to get into that, it's mind-blowingly brilliant at being able to tailor your communication to the individual. So my first bit of advice is, if you don't know about that, if what I've just said is kind of double Dutch, you don't know what that is, it would be worth finding out about that and enveloping that. But it's also about small things make a big difference. So little things like finding out and using their name, finding out how they like to be addressed. Do you prefer to be called Mrs. Hardy or Michelle? And then making a note of that. If they have refreshments, making a note of what the refreshments are. Oh, so you have tea with 1 sugar. And then next time you come in, hi Michelle, nice to see you. Would you like tea with 1 sugar? So those little tiny things that make the big difference. And we've all had it, right? I had it recently when I went into a restaurant, and it had been probably 12 months since I'd been in. And I walked in and the owner was like, oh, Barry, so nice to see you. And my God, it didn't matter what the food was like. The experience of the fact that this guy remembered my name, such a small thing when you think about it, but such a big thing to me. The fact that this guy remembered me, and it'd been a year and I'd not been. And it's like, then you start telling people, and I'm saying, you need to go here. They're so lovely. It wasn't about the food. It was about the experience. Mm. So little things, remembering, you know, important dates, or, you know, somebody's got a grandchild on the way. And so it's remembering those things that you can do without any training. Once you're doing all of that and you're like, actually, this is really nice. It's nicer for you. It's nicer for them. Then start to understand the nuances of communication, how you can identify how somebody else prefers to have things explained to them. And the example that I give most often was my eldest daughter, around about the age of 10, when I said to her, I would like to take you to Guildford. Well, I'll buy you lunch at Wagamama's and we'll go to Urban Outfitters. How do you feel about that? And my daughter was like, I don't know. And in that moment, I jumped to a conclusion that she was being really ungrateful. Once I then learned all these things, what I realized is that she's what we call highly visual. So she doesn't have to connect with her feelings to understand the world. And so when I said, how do you feel about that? She's like, I don't really know. When I know that, I can then say to her, hey, we're going to go to Wagamama's, da-da-da-da-da. Do you like the look of that? And she's like, yeah, that looks great. So not only when I learned that, did that improve my relationships with the people that I care about the most, because I was able to use language that was more about them, but it enabled me to communicate more clearly with patients. Because if you can imagine that scenario in a treatment presentation, and I say, Michelle, we got this crown and it's going to cost this, that, and the other. How do you feel about that? And you go, oh, my conclusion was she doesn't want it. It's too expensive. I'll just do a filling, not realizing that actually you might be highly visual and you're thinking, how do I feel about that? So then I changed my language. We do this crown, it's going to cost X. Do you like the look of that? And you go, yeah, looks good. And so I got out my own way as well. So there's another phrase called can I. It's not can I do something, it stands for constant and never-ending improvement. So I would say communication is about that process, is embracing the fact that no matter where you are, you can tweak, small tweaks, and you just keep improving, and it just gets better and better and better. And it's a never-ending journey, and it's fun.
Yeah, that leads me on quite nicely into, obviously from everything you're saying, Barry, the importance of staff training and having a right culture in a practice,
Yep.
Because it's delivering consistency, isn't it? And how do you get your whole team on board, as opposed to you might have a couple of key members that are really great at stuff, and then others drop the ball. So, how do you sort of evolve and develop that consistency to make sure that that patient experience is good every time?
So for me and my clients, what we develop is a culture deck. So is to have the owners of the business really look at what do they want their culture to be? How do they want to be delivering their dentistry, and what would they like their team to how do they want their team to interact? How do they want them to behave with each other and the patients? And building and constructing a culture deck, which you can see in big organizations like Netflix and Spotify, and you can go and look on places where they've got their culture deck. It explains who they are, what they do, what they're about. Firstly, that enables you then to recruit the people that like the idea of that culture. But with your existing team, if you develop that culture deck with them, then they buy into it. That almost gives you almost like a brief of expectations of how we behave with each other and how we behave with our patients. And it gives them an understanding. It's like formatting. So Bernice McCarthy in the 70s came up with this whole thing of how people like to learn, and it's called the format. Some people are why, some people are what, how, and what ifs. And so when you know that, and then you bring your team in to help develop the culture deck, and they're involved with it, firstly, they feel like they own it because they need to. There's no point going, here's our culture, you need to live by it, because that's not inclusive. You can do that when you're hiring, because here's our culture. Is that something that
Do you fit?
Do you fit?
Yes.
Right, and they can self-select that then. But then they also know, well, if that's where I'm going, I know what the expectations are. But it's actually an enjoyable and powerful thing to do with your existing team, because then you also get to find out if there's some clashes of values, or if somebody, doesn't like the sound of something, and it gives you a reason. And then you're able to discuss it, and they go, oh, I didn't realize it was about that. So it brings out into the forefront any concerns. And so culture deck is something that we did mission, values, and we did all of that years ago, goals, things like that. But over the last probably 10 years, a culture deck has been a really huge improvement, and involving them to do that, and then training them in those aspects, and then asking ourselves that everything we're doing for patients, does it fit in with what we agreed we were going to behave like within our culture?
Absolutely. And obviously trends are changing all the time, and just looking ahead, what do you anticipate we're going to be doing in the future to elevate that patient experience? Because it's a never evolving, cycle, isn't it? To keep looking at what you're doing, how can we improve on that? Do you see any sort of trends coming along that you think are going to have a bigger impact later on?
Trends, I don't know, if I'm honest, just thinking now. What I do think is that those practices that really focus on improving every element of the patient journey will be stronger and more robust and more financially sound than those that don't. As I said earlier, it's not about the dentistry. Of course, that's important, because that's what we're delivering. What's most important is the customer journey. So you've got to have good dentistry, and I want to have great dentistry. But I know that it's good dentistry that is enough,
Yeah.
and it's a great patient experience that really stands us out, and its reputation and its brand and it's our values. So our values of integrity and honesty and transparency and things like that. So maybe a trend may be that people become more focused on the patient journey. You know, if you look out, I mean, we're at the show today, and if you look at the show, it's all about the latest treatment. It's all about aligners. It's all about, you know, what's next in what we can do to patients. And it's less about what we can do with patients and for patients. And I think maybe the trend will begin to swing. It'll still stay there because there's always going to be technological innovations. There's always going to be things that develop new treatments and new modalities. But the thing that doesn't change is the personal interaction. We're not going to be replaced yet by AI and robots.
No.
And so I would love there to be a trend of all about patient care and experience.
Yeah, and just raising that expectation with every practice. You know, I mean, I just want to thank you so much because,
Thanks.
you know, the little insights that you've shared today, if somebody can only take away just a couple of those pointers to take them on the right direction with their teams to make it better for all of the patients, we all win, don't we?
Yeah, it's a win-win.
But thank you so much for your time today, Barry.
Thanks for having
It's
me
been
back.
lovely chatting to you.
Thanks.
And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you very much.